All right, everyone. Today, JavaScript events. Nothing happens in DOM without events, right? Everything that causes a change that would warrant a change on the DOM for us is our events. It's also important to remember that we are working with single page applications, right? Meaning for the rest of the program, you are going to have one singular HTML file, and we expect that the page never refreshes, right? There should never be a hard refresh on the page, meaning that we should never see this spinny bubble, right, or this spinning circle on our tab ever again in our applications, right? Our entire application is housed within one index.html file, and all of the changes are done using JavaScript. Okay. That is all done by events. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about event listeners and callback functions. Callback functions just kind of being a broad term for any time we call a method on an element or on really kind of anything, and it's asking for a function to take in as kind of instructions, right? So yesterday in the lecture, basically whenever you pass a function to another function and that function is essential to how that other function runs, we call that a callback function. We might be able to get more into the nitty gritty of what callback functions are in particular, but that's kind of basically the idea. We're going to see this a lot today. So event listeners, what are they, when and how we can use them? We'll talk about types of JavaScript events, events on the window, events on elements. We'll talk about event bubbling and capturing. So how does the browser respond to events? I don't think we really need to talk about stopping propagation today, but well, I'll send out a resource. We can get into it if we want to. Using event listeners and callbacks to make changes on the DOM, right? The big thing here. Event listeners pass an event object to the callback function. Practice appending the correct information to the DOM. We're basically going to start our first kind of what we would call DOM manipulation, right? So using JavaScript today to make changes to the DOM. We did that a little bit in our first lecture on Monday. Didn't really do that at all yesterday, but today we're gonna really start cooking with JavaScript, so to speak. Are there any questions from yesterday or the day before's lecture that anyone wants to touch on before I get started with this JavaScript events material? Okay, why didn't I pull this up before? So JavaScript events. I'm getting warm. Okay, so there are a bunch of events that we can choose from in JavaScript. You're only really going to use a handful of them in the program. And I'll give us kind of a demo of some of the, why don't I just kind of do that now? I feel like let's see. I'm going to kind of combine these 2 points together. So what kind of events are there? This says jQuery, ignore jQuery. We don't really use jQuery anymore. You might see some people still use it. I mean, it's definitely still in code bases, but jQuery was a kind of a modification of JavaScript, something kind of like a library that basically made some JavaScript code quicker and easier to write. The reality is that nobody really uses the vanilla JavaScript. We call the type of JavaScript that we're going to be writing during this module, we call it vanilla JavaScript because it's plain JavaScript, right? Once we get into React, we're going to be using React as like a library that uses a bunch of, it's kind of like macros in Rails, right? Methods are written for us that we can use to get a lot more done in a quicker amount of time. But here we're just writing essential JavaScript. And what you'll see is that you have to write a lot of JavaScript to just get a little bit done. But writing in vanilla JavaScript and knowing vanilla JavaScript is a feat. When writing in vanilla JavaScript was more popular, jQuery was a tool that people used a little bit more often to kind of help make the code a little bit shorter, right? But because of modern JavaScript libraries, we don't have to quite, most developers don't really write in vanilla JavaScript anymore. Okay, So here are a bunch of examples of events. So we have a click, pretty simple, right? When I click on this, the element is changing colors, right? All of these are gonna have a color change when the event fires. We have a mouse over, so when I take my mouse and I bring it into the element, right? It changes color. It never, when I leave, nothing happens, but when I come back in, something happens. We have mouse out, which is the opposite, right? When I come in, nothing happens, but when I leave, oh, that didn't work either. When I come in, when I leave, something happens. Come in, leave, right? Mouse down is when I hover over an element and nothing happens until I've clicked the mouse, right? Mouse up is I'm clicking on the mouse now, but nothing's happening until I release the click on the mouse. Mouse move is just whenever the element registers that the mouse is moving over the element, right? So very specific. The tiniest pixel change will cause this this element to the event to fire. We have a submit, so I can type in a name and a password, and when I submit the form, the event fires. I couldn't figure out what this one did. It looks like the exact same thing. I feel like this was something else before because I've always used this example and I've never noticed that it was the same thing. So I don't know why that submit is the same. We have a key down, which is when I press on a key on the keyboard. We have a key up. So right now I'm holding a key down, but it's not until I release the key that the event triggers. And then I have a key press, which is very similar to key down, except key down also accepts like arrows and it also accepts the delete, right? Whereas key press does not accept the arrows or the delete, right? Only letters or numbers that get typed in count as a key press. Change is when I type something in. Oh, that didn't work. It's for the drop down, I guess. So whenever I change a value in the drop down, the element changes, right? So that's one. These are also kind of on inputs, right? And when an input registers a change, but for some reason it's not working on the input fields. Focus, so also an event on a form, right? When I focus on an input field, we can see that the input field changes colors, and so does the drop down. And then blur is after you've left an input field, right? So when you focus is when you click on, blur is when you leave. Okay, so here are just some examples of JavaScript events, right? Again, go ahead.
What was the difference between click and mouse down?
Click and mouse down. I don't know, it's a good question. I feel like mouse down is a little bit antiquated because of the way mouses work now. Let's see. Because look, if I right click here, if I right click, this counts, but click is just a left click. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess that works. So mouse down would be like, if we were thinking about old mice or mice that usually have like the two individual buttons, the left and right button, right? Mouse down is going to get the left or the right button, but the click is only going to get the left. Right, so this is me clicking with one finger, and this is me clicking on my mouse with two fingers to trigger a right click. See? Okay, old mice. I don't know. I don't know. What else would you call them? Old mice. Okay, and then here are a bunch of events. These events are already written into JavaScript, so you don't have to come up with them, right? There's kind of like a finite amount. So here are all the focus events. We're not really using WebSockets. A lot of these, you know, it's okay that you don't know. We have form events for reset and submit. So whenever we're submitting a form, this will become important later. We'll definitely, I think we'll use this one today. Keyboard events, mouse events, drag and drop events. So there are a lot. And it looks like there are even kind of some events that exist on and off of the DOM. So the kind of concept of how an event is kind of permeating beyond the browser, I think is something that, you know, might be kind of happening. But as you're going to see, we're going to use a pretty select few amount of event types, and then, you know, you can let what you want to implement into your applications guide you into what other events are out there. And of course, you can reference MDN and kind of teach yourself about some of the events, and then maybe try some of them out. As hardware changes, events are also changing. So there are, I believe there's like a, oh, let's see. There are a couple, like, I don't remember what it was. There are a couple of scroll events. Yeah, so any of these that have like a down thumb are outdated. So you'll definitely see that there are some kind of outdated events that some browsers support. The great thing about MDM mouse wheel. So remember on mice back in the day when they had the little wheel in the beginning or in the middle, right? There was once a DOM event for that, but this is deprecated now. So what I love about MDN is that they have the browser compatibility at the bottom, and you'll see that not all events are compatible with all browsers. So Chrome supports this one, but Firefox doesn't. And one big thing about being a software engineer is browser compatibility, right? Does my application look good on all popular browsers? Or you might get the notification that says something like, hey, we noticed that you're using Internet Explorer or Safari, we recommend using Chrome, la-di-da-da. You've seen these things before, usually because people have built their application and maybe realize that it doesn't look good on other browsers, or the event doesn't work on the browser. So yes, browsers individually choose what they want to support and what they don't want to support. And that's not just with JavaScript, it's with CSS, it's with HTML, etc. So browser compatibility is a super important thing to think about. Okay. So yeah, just a handful of events to think about. I think, again, these ones are pretty popular, maybe some of the ones that we're going to use the most often. So how do we, how do we make these events kind of happen? Well, today we're going to build out this kind of application that I have here. It's like a bank of emojis. And I have some deliverables that I am going to have us kind of fill out. So as a developer, I want a form to appear in place of the add emoji button when the add emoji button is clicked. So when I click this button is going to disappear, and what's going to happen is a form is going to replace it, okay? An emoji can be entered into the input of that form, and when submitted, added to the emoji bank. So when the form appears, I'll be able to enter in an emoji, and then when I click submit, the emoji will end up in here as an LI on this emoji bank, okay? An alert saying emoji submitted whenever an emoji is submitted will appear at the top. So we should get a notification that says, hey, you submitted your emoji successfully. And then once I've submitted, the form should turn back into an add emoji button once it's been submitted successfully. And then this is kind of a stretch goal. I don't think I've ever gotten to this one during a lecture. An emoji I click on turns into this like face, which I've already done here. So maybe I should take that emoji out. And if you didn't know, if you're on a Mac, you can, I forget, oh shoot, now I'm forgetting. Is it? Yeah. If you do Control, Command, and the space bar, you can enter in emojis, and you can put them right into your HTML, and they work like that. Pretty cool, right? So we're going to come back to these other points kind of as we're working through the lecture. But let's just kind of dive right in. Do I have any questions so far before we continue? Okay, so we will start off by saying, here's another disclaimer. There are lots of different ways to do things in JavaScript. A lot of different ways. I wouldn't even be surprised if I taught JavaScript a little bit differently than another cohort lead in the program taught JavaScript. I teach JavaScript pretty similarly to how I was taught JavaScript, right? And my Flatiron School teachers, they may have had different opinions. I am going to try to prioritize a way of teaching you how to do things in JavaScript that I think is easier and that I think is more logical and that I think is going to help reinforce the basic principles of JavaScript and that I think is going to help set you up well for React. There are a couple things that I'm going to teach you in vanilla JavaScript that we're going to do slightly differently in React, but my goal here is to really emphasize like life cycle of elements on the DOM, and putting event listeners on correctly and firing events correctly, okay? So again, there are lots of different ways to do things in JavaScript, more so than in Ruby, and I understand that it can be frustrating, but I'm going to try my best to guide you down a path where you can kind of follow the logic most easily, okay? So the first thing that I always tell students to do, and this is going to expand as our applications become more advanced. But what I always tell students to do is to kind of look at the DOM here, and ask yourself, okay, based on the functionality that I've kind of lined out, what do I expect to change? Well, there are two elements here that I expect to change. I expect the add emoji button to disappear and be replaced with a form, right? So that's one element that I want. And the other thing is this emoji bank, right? So I know that these two things are going to be dynamic in some sort of way. So the first thing that I'm going to do before I begin anything else is just select those elements, okay? So select the elements that I know I will manipulate using JavaScript in some way. Okay. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say, let's make this add button equal to something. And let's try this out. So I have my HTML here. Who wants to take a stab at selecting this element using a query selector that we saw on Tuesday? So if I have this add button right here,
you could do get by ID,
yes.
the get by ID add button.
Document. Remember, I'm gonna call it on the sorry.
ID, parenthesis, quotes, add dash button.
Add dash button. Okay. Now, bear with me, because what you're gonna see is we're gonna start kind of at the most basic level, following this principle, right? But we might have to backtrack to make changes at some point. So this is also a practice in, building the code from a basic perception, like a level of how we perceive what we want to do, right? And then we might have to go back and make changes to kind of refactor or be more inclusive in how our code works. Okay. For now, you might not understand why I'm saying this to you, but I'm forewarning you that we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to kind of make we're going to kind of change how we think about the structure of the HTML on this page and these elements. Okay. Okay, so right, add button is one of them. The other one was the emoji bank, right? So I'm going to grab the emoji bank here, and can somebody else tell me? Well, I guess it's basically the same thing. So grab element by the ID, and we're going to say emoji bank. All right. Okay, so now that we've done that, we will determine which of these events needs an event listener, or which of these elements needs an event listener. So in order to determine which elements need an event listener, mock use the application in the browser and ask yourself which events are we waiting for, and ask yourself which elements are waiting for user interaction. Do you have a question in the chat? Oh, make it element by ID. Thank you. Okay. So if I am over here and I am thinking about what's going to change on my application, I know that when I click add emoji, I want the button to change, right? However, I also know that I want an emoji to eventually add be added into here, but I'm not doing anything to these elements specifically to promote that to change. We're going to use a form that we don't actually even see here yet to make that change, right? So for now, the only button that I really need is this add emoji button, okay, to have an event listener on it. So let's do that now. In order to add an event listener, what we do is we take the element that we want to add the event on, we say add button dot, the method is add event listener, okay? Add event listener takes the name of the event as a string, right? One of the events that JavaScript has already determined are the possible events. And can anyone take a guess at what we want to do or what we want this event to be?
Click.
Yep, Matt says click. We write it just like this, right? Remember, this has to be a string of one of the predetermined events in MDN, right? I wish that these actually, you know, I guess you could probably say that these are right. They're usually just written like mouse up. Let's see how they're written. Mouse down. Yeah, mouse down, mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse move. So they're usually all one word, all lowercase. This is going to change in React, but for now, you know, this is fine, right? So on click. And the second argument here is the callback function. So I'll take a second right now to discuss callbacks. So again, whenever a function or whenever a method requires a function as an argument to complete a logic that will be carried out in the future, we call that argument a callback function, right? Callback functions or methods that require callbacks can accept a function reference or an inline function definition, right? Just like we saw yesterday. I can either define a function down here, right, and pass the reference, or if we want to kind of follow the principle, you know, of always defining our functions and writing our, functions and writing our variables kind of at the top of our pages. Or I can define the function anonymously here, right? Either one works. I can either pass in a reference or an anonymous function definition, right?
Okay, I have a question.
Go for it.
So add event listener is the method.
Mm-hmm.
And then click is the event function or the event.
Right.
Okay. And
right.
So then the callback, on line 22, call their argument. Is that what that says?
Whenever a method requires a function as an argument to complete a logic that will be carried out in the future, we call that argument a callback function. So so in this case, it's the second argument, right? This is a callback function. But what we're basically saying is, hey, button, add button, right?
Uh-huh.
When someone clicks you, run this function that I'm giving you.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, that makes sense. Cool, thanks.
So hey, when someone clicks you, do this, okay? So right now what we'll do is we'll say, we're just gonna console log, I've been clicked. Okay. When I run this in the console, and because I don't want the same thing to happen yesterday where my, JS file gets cached, I'm just going to open it up in incognito. And as I click add emoji, I get this event in the console. I've been clicked, okay? One important thing to note about event listeners is that they automatically pass the callback function in event object. We can call these arguments whatever we want, right? E events. We usually, well, it looks like event is a reserved word, so let's just call this E. So when I click add emoji, I get that console log, but I also get the event. And it says, hey, this event is a mouse event. It happened on these coordinates, right? There are a bunch of really important attributes. We have the target element. This is the element that the event happened on. Here was the type of event, right? It happened at this time. A bunch of, well, there's a lot of stuff that we're never going to use, but there's also a bunch of stuff that we are going to use, right? That could be helpful at a certain point in the future, right? If you wanted an application where you clicked anywhere on the screen and little images of cute puppies appeared, right? You would definitely want the coordinates of where that happened on the page to kind of put those elements on the DOM, right? So the event objects give us a lot of information. One other thing to note about callback functions is that I wrote this console log inside of a function because I had a very specific thing that I wanted the console log to say. However, console log is a method in its own right? That I could simply pass the reference to, right? Console log just logs whatever the argument to that method is, right? So if I know that event listeners automatically invoke their callback functions, right? And I know that add event listener also automatically passes the callback function an argument of the event, then I can also just leave my function, my event listener callback like this, and what's going to get logged is the event itself. So this is a very kind of small but important thing that I need students to understand very quickly, right? The reason why I can't invoke a function inside of that place where you pass a callback is, remember, we're passing the event listener a reference to a function that it's going to use later. But whenever we use these parentheses, the function the function of the method is firing right in that moment, right? So think about it kind of like if you remember math class in PEMDAS, we think about the order of operations. Well, the things that happen in the parentheses like go first, right? Well, I don't even know if that's a great analogy. But whenever we're saying add button dot add event listener, right? And we have these parentheses, we're invoking a function right away, right? We're invoking this function right away because invoking this function sets up the event listener on this element, right? So we're saying, hey, when JavaScript is compiling this file, as soon as it gets to line 19, add event listener is a method that runs on the add button and the event listener gets established, right? However, in order for that method to run, it needs to interpret what's inside of the parentheses. So it says, okay, we've got click and we've got console.log, but if I have this kind of parenthesis here and I say, we'll see that this fires before the event even runs, right? Look, I never clicked add emoji, the button, but the console log ran because the console log, right, is being invoked right in that line. And that's not what we want to do because we want the console log to run when the function, or sorry, when the element has been clicked, right? If I go ahead and click on this element now, nothing is happening because the return value of console log when it's invoked is nothing. So we've basically added an event listener on this button that does nothing when it's clicked, right? So it's important to remember that we never want to invoke a function that is a callback, right? When we're passing in a reference, we never want to invoke it. We want to leave it as a reference so that the event listener decides when the function is invoked, right? And now that I've done that, console log receives an argument, right? And that argument from the event listener is automatically the event, so that's what's going to get logged in the console. I wanted there to be a longer message, right? I wanted there to be a longer message in the console log when the button is clicked. But because I can't do that specifically right here, I had to define a whole new function whose sole purpose was to console log a custom message that I made, right? So this is a small distinction that you're gonna have to get used to, but you never want to pass in a reference to a function, right? And invoke it right away in that callback slot. Are there any questions about this?
Chris, can you hear me?
Yes.
I am not fully understood because I think looking at this, the function, because you have the parentheses after it, isn't that invoking the function? Which
This one here?
Yeah.
This is, all functions have this, right? This is where you pass in the arguments.
So it's just defining the function then.
Yeah, this is a function definition, right? The return value of a function definition is the reference of the function, right?
Say that again.
The return value of a function definition is the reference of the function, right? So I can say something like, I could do function callback, or I could say let callback equal function. Either of these ways would work, right? And I could define a function here, console log I've been clicked, right?
Right.
And then I can just put callback here. This is also gonna work.
Yes,
Right?
you're referencing the function there.
This is a referencing function, but I'm also saying that if I just put this in here, this is going to work the same way because the return value of a function definition is just the reference, and we're storing the reference in a variable here.
Okay. Whereas I guess maybe then my misunderstanding is how console log, and then in parentheses the string that you put in, is actually
Because that gets called when the function gets called, right? The function is saying, hey, when you run me, do this.
Mm-hmm.
But in order for the console log to run, the function has to be invoked.
So it's not a reference, it's like actually
Yes,
invoking.
this is not a reference to the function because we're actually invoking the console log inside of this function, but it's not until this function gets invoked. Right, so
Mm-hmm.
let's look at this. So if I refresh this page, I know that I have callback in here. It's a reference to a function, right? And this is what the function does inside of it. But when I call that function, then the console log runs.
Gotcha.
Right? So just because I reference the function, the function reference just has instructions inside, but the instructions don't run until I've actually invoked it, right?
That's where my trip up was, like you're invoking it with those parentheses after it there, right?
Yes, exactly. You use the parentheses to invoke the function. There's no parentheses here. That's just a reference. You use the parentheses to invoke, right?
Yeah, but in your current code and Adam.
But here I'm defining the function because I've used the function keyword before. So this is not an invocation. This is where the events, this is where the arguments go.
It's just because you're using the function keyword. Like, okay. But if you didn't use the function keyword, if you were using any other type of function, even other than callback, it would be cool.
Any function definition requires these double parentheses. The double parentheses don't mean invocation unless you put them after a reference, or you could automatically invoke the function, but it would need to come after the function definition. So whenever you see the word function and parentheses, this is still a function definition, right? This is the space where arguments go. Right? And then they can be used inside. Okay. If you're still struggling with this, let's talk about it afterwards. But this is just something that might take some practice to get familiar with.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Okay. So, right. Again, something that we're going to see all the time, right? You can define the function in line. or you can define it outside, right? This is the same thing as doing this. In this case, we're writing an anonymous function and saving it to a variable. In this case, we are writing our function and using the space between the word function and the parentheses to determine the variable name. So we're naming our variable here, and that our function here, and it becomes a variable that we can access the function with later. Here is the callback, right? Remember that event listeners automatically pass in the event to their callback function. So I can define, I want to do this. So I can define the function and accept the argument of the event and console log it here, knowing that the argument is going to be passed in when the event listener runs. Okay. So notice here that just because I've passed in the reference of the function, when I defined the function, I created the space for an argument to be received. Whenever we pass a function reference to a callback or as a callback function argument to a method, you and I don't see the invocation happening, right? Because the invocation happens in the browser when I actually click the button when the event is triggered. So you never want to invoke the function yourself. And earlier someone asked, what happens if you call a function? What happens to the values if you don't pass in anything as an argument? Well, let's see. They're just undefined. So if I set up a function to receive an argument, but that argument never gets passed in, then the value of that argument inside of the method is just undefined. Inside of the function is just undefined. So again, never do this. Always pass in a reference or define the function in line. And I wonder what happens if you do this. So look here, even though I passed in the name for this function when I defined it in line, the variable name didn't stick. So that's why these should always be anonymous, because even though we name them, they don't persist outside of this scope, it seems like. So no point in naming the functions that you write in line. Okay, back to this. So again, this is a tricky part of JavaScript, but we're gonna see it a lot. I'm gonna reiterate this every lecture that we go through, okay? I know this is tricky. So now that I've covered callbacks, I wanna talk a little bit more about events. So we know that when I click this button, we get a console log, and the event is also logged because I've included it there, right, as the argument here. Events do what's called event bubbling and event capturing. So basically what happens is when you click on, whenever you click on a target of an event, first the parent elements receive it, or the great-great-grandparents receive it, right? The most further out element receives it, and then the event moves inward on the elements until it reaches the target. Once it hits the target, the event fires. But after the event fires, the event bubbles, which means it reverberates back out. And I know this is crazy, so I have some examples here for you. Let's do capturing first. So people don't use capturing very much, but you'll kind of see what I mean. So if there is an event on this TD element right here, and someone clicks on it, what happens first is the window first identifies the event, then the document, then the HTML tag, then the body tag, then that table, and then that tBody tag, and then the element finally receives the event. And whatever event listener is on that event will fire. After that event fires, the event bubbles back up to the top. So we can see this happening here when there's an event listener right here on this p tag. Let's see, where did they put it? Oh, I guess it's on all of them. Okay, so if I click on this p tag, we're gonna get some alerts. And up top it says, okay, the HTML tag has recognized the event happening. Then the body tag has recognized the event happening. And then the form, right, has recognized the event happening. The next is gonna be the div, right? And then the P, right? This is the target of the event. And now that we've reached the target, we're gonna move back up, right? The P tag again is now saying, I've received the event, I'm emitting back out into the DOM, right? The div is now receiving the bubbling effect, right? Now the form, and then it's gonna be the body, and then the HTML again, right? So that is kind of how events are processed in the DOM. So although yes, we did click just on the P tag, every parent and grandparent element of that element that we clicked is aware of the click happening. And you can use this to your advantage, right? We will use this in just a little bit with one of the examples that we are going to talk about, or finishing out this app that we're building. But bubbling and capturing, super important. Again, people use bubbling, which is after the event has reached the target, it bubbles back out. People use bubbling more so than capturing, right? We'll talk about that later. Basically, what I mean is that if I set an event listener, and this is what we're going to use in a little bit. If I set an event listener on the form for when a click happens, right? But someone clicks on the P tag, that event bubbles up from the P tag to the form, firing the form's event listener as well. Okay, so whenever you set an event listener on a parent element and one of the child elements also has that event happen to it, the parent will eventually know about it, right? All parent elements, basically, yeah, all parent elements and grandparent elements of the element that the event happened to, right, will know that the event happened. And if there are any event listeners on them, they will trigger, okay? However, if I click on div, right, the event will never reach down to the P tag. So again, we'll dive into this more in a little bit. But bubbling and capturing, super important. I will link this in the README because it is a cool document to reference. Okay, so where were we? We're still back here. Well, before we move on, any other questions that I can cover on this really quickly?
Yeah, so is the point of bubbling like so that multiple events would fire like at the same time?
Maybe if you want to. I'm going to use this as an example in a second. So hang on with me if you don't get it quite yet. But you know, yeah, we'll see an example here in a second. Tori asks why we would want to use this. I don't think that it's a very commonly used thing, except for in the example that I'm going to give you in a little bit. But you might be coming across a project. What if you're like creating an art JavaScript project, and when someone clicked on the P tag that was in the center, maybe you're making like a psychedelic application where there are a bunch of squares nested within each other. And when someone presses the middle square, right, the colors change all the way into the center and then all the way back out. You can kind of imagine doing something like that using bubbling and capturing, right? If you wanted to have that kind of cool color effects of like, okay, colors are moving in and then they're moving back out, right? That's kind of maybe the most easy visualization of that. And that it might be a useful reason for that. Maybe you're creating like a JavaScript art piece or something, But again, I'll get into an example of why I think that bubbling is useful. Okay, so right now we just have an event listener on our add emoji button that console logs that the mouse has been clicked. Okay, so what we really want to do here is once the add button has been clicked, right? We want to add a form, right? We want to remove the add button, and we want to put a form in, right? So what we want to do is we will say, okay, we want to take out everything that is inside of this div that's called add emoji area. We want to replace the button with a form. So that signals to me that there is another element that we didn't think to grab here, right? We grabbed the add button specifically, but I eventually want to get rid of the add button and replace everything inside of this entire add emoji area div with a form. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to just grab the add emoji area using my document get element by ID. Remember, you can also use query selector. And these both work. And I can test this out in the console. Add emoji area is this div right here. Cool. All elements have a attribute called inner HTML. So if I ever want to change something about the add emoji area, if I type in inner HTML here, we can see that as a string, there is an HTML for the rest of for the rest of the code inside, which is for now is just a button. But we want to replace this button, right, with a form tag. So I'm going to say inner HTML equals, and then just writing in plain, writing as a string, right? I can go ahead and write the HTML for the form. And notice that when I'm using the equal sign, I'm reassigning this variable value, right? I'm not adding to it, I'm reassigning it, right? So add emoji area inner HTML, I can start by saying form with an ID of add emoji form if I want to add a form. And I'll put an input for type equals text. And the unfortunate thing about using this string is obviously we don't get the nice coloring and predictive text, but it's okay. We're not doing anything crazy here. Type equals text, and then I don't know, maybe we can give this an ID too of add emoji input. And close this out. You'll see me getting into the habit of any kind of tags that can close themselves by just putting a slash at the end of them. Once we get to React, React kind of expects that, even with break tags. You can't, this would throw an error. So I have just really gotten into the habit of closing out my tags like that. You can say input type equals submit. You can say value is that emoji. Close this out like that, and then our form is done. So once this button has been clicked, the add emoji area inner HTML should be cleared and replaced with this HTML of the form. Let's test it out. Nice. That was great. We also have kept our console log in there. So we've officially kind of done some DOM manipulation, right? We changed things on the DOM without having to refresh our page. And that was what we wanted. Right now, I don't have the logic set up to turn this back, but I can just refresh and we can see. Any questions so far? I'm going a little bit quickly now because we're nearing close to time, but we can eat into office hours a little bit as well. I want to take a second here to let people know that this is not the only way, of course, to what we would say append elements to the DOM. You will often see people do things like document.create element div, and this will create a div element for you. We can save that div element to a variable. And you can give that div attributes. Oh, that didn't work. Div, why didn't that work? Div.id is it? There we go. And then we can say like document, or and then we can say, you know, like div.innerText equals I'm a div. And then we can say document.append child div. And that'll appear. Oops. Is an O. You can only one element on document allowed. Okay, yeah, so it can't be that. It can be, we would have to say the body would be let body, or we can append it to the add emoji area. Why don't we just do that? So add emoji area is already a div, and we can say append child div, something like this. I'm just testing this out, right? And that's, and we can see that just using JavaScript, I've created a new div and I've put the div on here. This is kind of a more modular way to create elements. Again, you can see this, it's possible to do things this way, but I'm strongly discouraging you from doing this and, you know, just using strings to write out your HTML, because this can become long and laborious. And while there are certain use cases for it, once we get to React, all of our elements will be basically written like this, as if it were HTML. So,
Hey, Chris.
Go ahead.
So like in one of the labs, it was having us do it that laborious way, and
Yeah.
I was getting that same error that you just got. Could you help me understand that error a bit more? How it says only one element on document allowed?
Right, so the DOM can only have one element, and that element is the HTML element.
The document itself?
Yeah, it can only have one. The whole, like, our HTML
Oh, okay.
needs to be held in type 1, and so it's saying the document can only have one element, so we can't put another. It's telling us that we can't add another document to the DOM because it can only have one document at a time. So if we want to append something, that we have to find a child element to append it.
Could you just do like document dot body dot, or you
Sure.
can just body dot, or whatever?
I think you can do document.body. I don't know. Document.body, does that work? Yeah, document.body.append child. That also worked, but I don't know where it went. Where did it go? It should have come up here twice.
Just replace it? Maybe?
No, because there should be one in here. Unless I think I may have refreshed the page. Yeah, I guess I refreshed the page. Did I?
I didn't see it. Refresh.
Well, I just erased everything, so.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's weird. Maybe I just add emoji area. It should have gone here, but yeah. So, anyways, you just have to select a child element to append it to.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have this working so far. Again, it's important to know the long and laborious way. So if the labs are showing it to you, don't disregard that. It's totally important. That's a major fundamental piece of how we're using JavaScript, or how JavaScript can be used. But I'm going to make the argument that using this inner HTML for the time being is going to get us places a lot faster. You're going to hear the argument that you should never use inner HTML and add user inserted text, because if you did that, people could write JavaScript that would send cookies to emails, right? And you would essentially be appending that to the DOM without clearing it in any way. And our applications would then could potentially be sending private information to, when if we didn't like clean out our data that users had submitted, and we let people literally type in JavaScript and submit it to our application where it was appended in the database and everyone could see, right, then we could potentially have errors where people hack our websites using JavaScript. However, I'm going to make the argument that no one here is going to write an application that's handling sensitive data, sensitive enough for that to kind of be a problem. And that when you are working on big scale applications, of course, even when we get to using our backends, we can sanitize our data before they're committed to the database at all. So it's important to read up about arguments about why inner HTML is, is scary to use. But again, for the purposes of the program and for the fact that we are going to be sanitizing our data later when we start using our databases, I'm gonna stick with it. Okay. Okay. So wow, I thought I cut stuff out so that we would go faster, but I guess not. Okay, if you need to leave, feel free to do so. I'm just going to continue for another 15-20 minutes to get this deliverable completed. Right now, I'm about to talk about why bubbling would be useful. So stick around if you want to see that, but I understand if you have to go. I'll post the recording as soon as it's done loading. Okay, so we have our form. The next deliverable here is that once I have the form appears, I want to add an emoji in the input, submit it, and then add it to the emoji bank. Okay. So I can use my control command click, and I want to add this clown emoji and click add that emoji. And then when that emoji adds, why isn't it? There we go. It should appear in here. Now notice two things happened. First is that, I don't know if you guys could tell, but our page hard refreshed. It is the default property of forms to hard refresh the page. So we're gonna have to use JavaScript to stop this. So we'll talk about that. And then we have to come up with the logic of how we are gonna get our input field, whatever emoji we inputted, to appear in the emoji bank. However, the kind of problem that we're really facing with before we can move forward at all is that we need to put an event listener on the form, right? Well, the form doesn't exist until this function runs, right? So at this point, I can't really, I can't define the the variable that points to that element on the initial compilation, because when the page loads, the form isn't even in the HTML at all, right? However, I need to put an event listener on this button to get the rest of my application to work. So there are a couple of things we can do here. Again, I'm going to briefly talk about a few of the ways that we can get some of these things done, but I personally am going to show you the way that I think is going to be the most beneficial for helping you understand event listeners and kind of the basic concepts of JavaScript. Okay, so alternative number one, which again, these are all totally viable. You might see other people do these. Other people might have chose to teach you these ways, but I'm not going to teach you or not encourage that you do them this way. One thing that we could have done is we could have had the form on the HTML the entire time. And we could have just simply made, we could have had the styling so that the display was hidden or none, right? I think it's, oh shoot, I'm forgetting how to do inline styling. Display, I think it's, I feel like it's like this. Let's see if this works. Nope, that didn't work. Display. How do I do this? Does anyone remember? Oh, there it is, like that. So the add emoji area has that form, but the display, it's not displayed, right? And then we could go ahead and add the event listener there, right? That would have worked, that could have worked. Oh no, all my colors, really? You took them all away? What is up with Atom lately? 0 out of 10 user experience. Okay, so that's one way we could have done it. And then easy for us, whenever we click the button, we could have simply turned off the, we could have simply, you know, done the same thing with the button. We could have said style display none, form style display, or display none here. And then we could have said, or wait, that's supposed to be, yeah, display none, right? Or hidden, yeah, none, and then turn this one to true or something like that so that it's visible. The reason I don't want to teach you this way is because we're going to be working with huge applications, right? And we don't want to have all of the HTML for our entire application on the screen. If we have 10 pages on our single page application and they're all there, but they're all hidden, that's a lot of kind of crowded HTML, in my opinion, right? So I don't think that this is, you know, for a small application like this, maybe it is a good way, but we can have it on the DOM just so that you can't see it, and then change that styling so that it's possible. So that's one way we could have done it, right? Another way we could consider doing this is by, right, because the whole point here is that we want to add an event listener. It is possible to write event listeners in line. We could say on click, and then we could reference the name of a function. Oh, this is going to drive me bonkers. Okay, copying and pasting worked. You know, and we could say that when someone clicks this function, we want to, you know, handle submit. We want handle submit to run, right? This is the way that we're going to do things in React. However, again, I don't think that this really reinforces the concepts of JavaScript that I'm trying to teach you. Okay, so again, you might see people write event listeners in line on the elements themselves, which works. Let's see if this works. Hold on. Right. Oh yeah, hold on, that didn't work. Handle submit right now. We'll take the event in, and we'll say, hold on, I don't do this very often, so I'm just gonna Google it. Write event listeners on elements. No. Add on click to element. Let's see. Sorry, this is just going so slow. Okay, yeah, so it's on click equals handle click like this. Okay, so it would be submit like that. Does it even pass in the event in? Yeah. Let's see. Prevent defaults. Prevent default is what we do when we don't want the form to submit. Let's see if this works. And we'll say log is, we made it. Nope, it's not working. I don't know. I thought these worked. I'm confused about why they're not working right now. Okay, wait, hold on. I'm getting something. Uncaught cannot define property of prevent default. Even if, okay, so pass an E here. Handle submit. Okay, what I can also do, so it is working, but the event's just not getting passed in. So here's a great example, a great moment to talk about debugger. And debugger is kind of like the bybug or the binding pry of JavaScript. You just literally type debugger in your code, and in the console, it'll recognize it and it'll stop the, oh, it's still not working. That sucks. I guess because by the time the form is submitted, the page is already beginning to refresh. So it won't even hit the debugger, which sucks. Okay. What if I just do click? Not submit. Oh, that'll still work. That'll still not catch it. Oops, sorry. On click. What if I put this on the form? I mean, let's see. There we go. Okay. E is not defined. So the event listener is running. It looks like the event listener is running. Let's take these out. But the event isn't getting passed in. Okay, so now we've hit our debugger. And then from inside of the debugger down here, there's like we can basically open up the console. We can move over to the console and we can test and ask ourselves, based inside of where the debugger is put, what variables do we have access to? What values are our arguments, etc. So let me try this again. We hit the debugger. Is the E in here? Yeah, so the E is undefined. Interesting. So if I say DOM on event handlers, why don't the events get passed in? Oh shoot, that's gonna suck because everything's talking about events here. I'll have to look into a little bit more about why the event isn't automatically getting passed into the inline functions, but nevertheless, it's not the way that we're going to do it anyways. So I'm not going to spend more time talking about it right now. However, there is some world in which you can write the event handlers inline. We're not going to do this. Okay, so we have this problem. We need an event listener to go on the form, right? Or on the button, at least when we click it or something. But again, this element doesn't exist when the page first loads, right? It only exists once we've put it in using the inner HTML and adding it in as a string, okay? So here is where bubbling becomes useful, in my opinion. Instead of having a bunch of very specific event listeners, I kind of have this concept, this principle that I like to call, it's very Lord of the Ringsy, but one event listener to rule them all, okay? What if we determined an element which had several children elements that are dynamic, that change, that sometimes are there, that sometimes are not there, right? And because if any event happens on them, it bubbles up to the parent, what if we let the parent determine what happens in the event, right? What I mean to say is, let's not put the event listener on the add button, but let's put the event listener on the parent element, right? If I put the event listener on this add emoji area, the add emoji area will receive events bubbled up from any of its children, and we can use that bubbling effect to determine which events to do based on what the child elements are. To look at this a little bit more closely, we see that add emoji area right now has the add button. When I click add emoji, the add button goes away, and now it's the add emoji form, right? So you might be asking, okay, Chris, well, how do we do this? And I'll show you. So on this, on the add emoji area, I'm now going to put the event listener on here. And I'm going to make this a more specific name because just like in Ruby, I'm also going to be very pushy and straightforward about having you be very descriptive about your function names. I'm going to say like, let's see, add emoji area handler. Okay. Add emoji area handler. And what we're going to see is that I'm going to comment this out for now. And I'm going to console log the target of the event, right? So in this case, when I click this in the console, it says I've been clicked. And the target for that click was the add emoji button, right? Oh, of course, I should have kept this in here. Refresh. When I click again, the target is now different. It is the add emoji input text, or the input field, right? So we see that because of bubbling, right, when I click on one element, the event bubbles up to the parent elements. And if any of the parent elements have event listeners on them, they fire, right? We put an event listener on the parent element, add emoji area. So when any of the child elements have an event happen to them, it eventually bubbles up to the parent. And if it's a click, it's gonna trigger the event handler, the event listener. Okay. Emoji area event handler. Make that even more specific. So now I can ask the question: if the target of the event has an ID of add button, then I know that the add button is the element currently on the DOM, right? And I want to remove it and replace it with the form. Otherwise, I can make the assumption that the form is on the screen. We need to add the button back, right? So add emoji puts that on. Click it again. Oh shoot, I forgot to do that. Let's do this. The form is on the screen. We need to add the button back, right? One event listener to rule them all, right? We've determined now that a lot is going on in the add emoji area element. So I'm just going to put an event listener on that element itself and handle all of the elements that the children bubble up to it. Okay. Are there any questions so far?
So by putting it on the parent in this case, whenever the parent event listener, whenever JavaScript recognizes the parent event listener, it will also, I guess what am I saying? Any of the children's being activated will be recognized by the parent's event listener. Is that
exactly? As long as the event is a click.
As long as the event is a click.
Exactly.
And where is that click indicated as the event?
When we click here. Right?
Oh, there it is. Event listener click. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So if it said add emoji was the initial button, right? And then when you click that, it turns into, I can't remember, whatever, add that emoji, right? If you, for some reason, wanted that, add that emoji event to be not a click, you wanted it to be like a mouse up or mouse down. Just, I know it sounds weird, but the point is if that...
You would have to create a different event listener for it.
Yeah, okay, so like this works as long as all the events underneath the parent are the same type of event.
Right, which is making me now wonder, because we're using a form and that's ultimately going to be a submit. And I don't think that submit bubbles up to the parents. Let me double check. Submit doesn't bubble. So I might have worked myself into a corner here. Which events do not bubble? Let's just try it. let's see. Okay, no, wait, so they do bubble, but, ooh, shoot. Okay. Right. So, because the form could technically be a submit. And if it does submit, then the event listener isn't going to register. Okay, so how would I do this? Add emoji every event handler. Well, yeah, so I guess what I could do then is I guess I would have to create a second event listener. Where I said something like, so it's not one event handler to rule them all, I guess, in this case. If it's a submit, then we'll say add emoji area button. We're still using bubbling though. Add emoji area button click. And we'll say add emoji area form submit. Add emoji area form submit. So yeah, that's a good point. These are two different types of events. e.prevent default. And let's console log to even sure. Are we even getting here? Let's see. Let's see what happens. Yeah, cool. Okay, so that works. So yeah, Ryan, thanks for pointing that out. Because the form, the other thing to kind of note too, and the reason why we might like to keep this here is because let's see. Either way, the submit is going to catch it. That's fine. Okay, yeah, we can just leave that. Okay, so we're not using the one event listener to rule them all. That'll be a concept that I bring back at another point. But we're still using bubbling here because notice that the submit is on the parent, right? But it's not on the form itself. So we can still put the event listener on the parent, right? So here I've added my e.prevent default, and this is what prevents the form from submitting when I submit it, or the page from refreshing rather. Oops, yeah. The page doesn't refresh. We can see that we've done this 8 times now, which is what we want. And once somebody submits the form, we want to take the emoji, right? And what we can do at this point, it's also important to remember that you can use query selectors inside of methods. In this case, again, we are looking for an element that doesn't exist until the form page has loaded. So that is going to be this input field, right? So we'll say like let input equal event, or sorry, document, or we can even be more specific and say add emoji area dot get element by ID. Right? You can call get element by ID on specific elements if you know that if you're looking for something inside of their children, right? But running it on document would have worked just fine. And we can say add emoji input. And then what we want to do is we want to take the value of the emoji input and we want to append it to the DOM inside of the emoji bank. So I'm just going to say emoji bank dot inner HTML. And instead of overwriting it using the equal sign, I'm going to append a string using the plus equals operator. And I don't know if this is something that we used in Ruby. I think it was. The plus equals operator changes the value versus like concatenating and then returning a new value, right? So if I'm over here and I have a string, hi and then I have let name equals Ryan. And I say string plus name is hi Ryan. String has not changed and name has not changed. But if I say string plus equals name, right? String has now changed to be hi Ryan, right? So that's kind of one way to concatenate. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say emojibank.innerHTML plus equals to preserve the emojis that I already have in there. They are stored, by the way, as, let's see, as LIs, I believe, right? And I'm going to say plus equals, and as a string, say li, and then I'm going to interpolate the input dot value of whatever was in the input field. So let's test this out. I'm gonna put an emoji in here, clown. That's not working, what happened? Add emoji area to element ID is not a function. Add emoji area, is it really? You can't call it on that? Wow, I totally lied. Is it add emoji area dot query selector? That's what it is. Add emoji input. There we go. Okay, so you can't use get element by, you can only use query selector. No problem.
Why is that?
Don't know. There we go. So
Is it kind of like is it like when we were using query methods in Active Record, you can't use like find. Sometimes you have to use like find by and find where
that's
totally
way
different.
That's totally different.
Okay. What is Ruby and
I
JavaScript?
think that I don't know why get element only works on the document. And query selector can work on individual elements. I don't know off the top of my head. Okay, so we've done what we wanted to happen, right? We've taken the emoji and we've put it inside of our emoji bank, but I want this form to go away now, and I want the old button to come back, right?
Is he frozen?
Yeah.
I thought I was frozen, but yeah, it looks like he's frozen.
I thought maybe he was just thinking for a second.
I'd see how long it takes to figure out.
I'll Slack him.
It usually takes me like 5 minutes to figure out.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. How long have I been frozen for?
Not long. Like
Not long.
20 seconds.
Right.
You're
when
about
you
to
said
tell
you
us
logged
about
in,
getting rid of the form.
Oh, okay. So what I did was I went back to the original HTML. I copied what was there originally, and I'm just doing what I did to add the form. I'm rewriting the value of the inner HTML to now have the button in there, right? So now I add it, I close it, and it goes back. And because this button has the ID, right? The event listener catches it, right, on the parent element. So we've completed like oops, I should put in some sort of JavaScript validation so that you have to submit something. I didn't do the alert. I guess the alert could be, we could do that right here. We could say alert, emoji successfully added. Ooh. Cool. So I know there was a lot. I always say that after lectures. It's always going to be a lot. Let's just get used to it. But again, to kind of recap, we selected the elements that we determined were going to be manipulated by the DOM in some way. We ended up not using add button directly, I don't believe. We should instead put our event listeners on the parent element and required or relied on bubbling to achieve the effects for us. We determined which of the events needed the event listener, right? I just kind of went over that. And then we added the event listeners to correspond and ultimately build out our functionality, right? When someone clicks on the button, it's replaced with a form. Once the form has been submitted, we prevent the form from refreshing the page. That is not what we want, but that is the default performance of HTML forms, right? We took the input value of the form and we added it to our emoji bank, putting it inside of LIs. We got rid of the form and replaced it again with the button, and then we added an alert to say that the emoji was successfully added, which it was. Okay. So thanks again for hanging out with me on these JavaScript lectures are really just a doozy and always go over. So thanks for sticking around. I'll start open office hours now. If you have any questions, please stick around and ask. The only thing that I'm going to do in the meantime is put in my order for my lunch delivery. So give me just like 2 seconds.